So on to gate number 55. So you'll recall we're stepping through these 108 gates of Dharma illumination, or at least I am, one at a time, 1 week at a time. This week we are up to number 55, which is the Dharma as an abode of mindfulness is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it wisdom is free from blurs. So you will recall that we've moved into a section of this text which is about the Satipatthana, or the four foundations of mindfulness. So each of those four gate statements takes up one of those aspects. So we've done body, feeling, mind, and now we're on to Dharma. So we've seen how these abodes of mindfulness are helping us sort of see and understand the process of how we have an experience. First we saw how the sense organs of the body have some contact with something. Out of that arises feeling or sensation, and we decide immediately this is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. That's not a sort of intellectual cognitive process. It's just bang, we know right away, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So thoughts and emotions arise in the mind for us related to that, and then we do something that creates karma, right? We say something, we take some action, we do something that creates karma. So the last of these four gates reminds us that in this world, this world of sort of form and human activity and human experience is only one side of reality. It's important, we're not negating it, but it's not the whole story. So there is also, as this gate statement says, the wisdom that is free from blurs. So the Dharma here is simply the reality of our moment-by-moment experience. We know there are multiple ways to think about this word Dharma. So in this particular case, it's simply talking about this one unified reality. It's talking about, the functioning of the universe. So that's Dharma. Now, wisdom here is prajna. Prajna is seeing the emptiness of all conditioned things. So, by the way, of the three poisons, ignorance is said to be the most basic of those three, and that's ignorance of impermanence and interconnectedness and emptiness. So then, wisdom that sees emptiness becomes even more important if we understand that ignorance is the most basic kind of delusion. So if our biggest problem is that we're out of touch with emptiness, then that seems like something we ought to pay attention to. So, right? So we need to talk about wisdom, and we also need to talk about emptiness, but let's start with emptiness first. So the Aksayamati Sutra says, when bodhisattvas rest and look at experience, they don't see any experience at all. Therefore, there are no virtues of a Buddha. Therefore, there is no awakening. Therefore, there is no path. Therefore, there is no liberation. Therefore, there is no salvation. Knowing that all experience has no salvation, they attain the meditative absorption of great compassion known as undistorted. So in other words, bodhisattvas understand that all their ideas about their experience and all the emotions that arise from that are without substance. These are things that we create by ourselves. So there's also no permanent self that has delusions or has three poisons, and there's no delusion or three poisons to sort of be possessed, right? So all of these things are empty of any fixed permanent nature. So Hojo-san says looking for the self is like peeling an onion. Maybe you've heard him say this, right? Apart from the layers, there is no onion there. If we keep peeling the layers and peeling the layers, ultimately there's no onion there. There's nothing other than the layers that make it up. So it's a great example of emptiness, right? Just like there's no self apart from the five skandhas that make up this thing that we call me or I. There's nothing there that has some independent existence. So you might remember that the last time I mentioned that Uchiyama Roshi calls the three marks of existence the three undeniable realities, which is a great way to think about this. So he says, the third undeniable reality is that all things lack substantial independent existence. This is Shoho Muga. Since nothing is substantial by itself, just as it is, there is nothing to hold on to. This means your thoughts are not something to hold on to either, so the only thing to do is to let go of all that comes into your head. The expression letting go of whatever arises is my own way of expressing the idea of ku, or emptiness. This can also be interpreted as without body or form, or not being tied to form. We can talk about this or that only because we grab onto or try to make some connection with something. Letting go of whatever arises is not trying to forge a link with some outside object. This is the truth derived from the third undeniable reality. So Hojo-san sometimes talks about three kinds of emptiness. He says, when there's a container, there's something at the bottom of the container, and then there's empty space at the top of the container. So there's space that's only occupied by air. So if you have a glass of water, at the bottom there's water, and at the top of this glass there's some empty space, which is only occupied by air. The second kind of emptiness is that there's space that doesn't disappear even when it's not occupied by something. So that space doesn't appear or disappear or change. It's not defiled or pure depending on what's in the space. It's just space. The third kind of emptiness is that there is emptiness as prajna, or emptiness as seeing everything without self-nature. This is the way the Buddha sees, right? This is the Buddha's view. So this third kind of emptiness is not like empty space at the top of the container that only contains air, a sort of lack of being. It's also not the space that allows everything to exist. Its emptiness is the reality of all beings that penetrates the whole universe. So this is the world of the five skandhas as Buddha lives in that world, right? This is the way he sees and understands, or a Buddha sees and understands. Five skandhas and the world of form. So Hojo-san says, to follow the Bodhisattva path, we study and practice prajna paramita, the wisdom that sees impermanence, knows self, emptiness, and interdependent origination. When we clearly see this reality that we and other things exist together without fixed independent entities, our practice is strengthened. We understand that to live by vow is not to accept a particular fixed doctrine, but is a natural expression of our life force. So he goes on to say in other places that the Raksu, or the Okesa, is a great example of emptiness, because it starts out as a bunch of little pieces of cloth, maybe have come from various places, we don't know. Those get assembled together and sewed into a robe, and that robe stays in that shape for a while. So he says this robe is more than a uniform. It embodies basic Buddhist teachings. If we really look at those of us who have Raksu, or those of us who have Okesa, and we remember how we put those together, it's a great example of emptiness. There were lots of little pieces. We put them together in a new form, and it's going to keep that form for a while. But we know if you've had a Raksu or an Okesa for a long period of time, it falls apart. We have mending to do from time to time. Things happen to that Okesa, right? So even that is not permanent. Even though we think, well, that's Buddha's robe, even that in its way is a wonderful example of emptiness. But there's a more subtle way that the robe is a manifestation of this kind of emptiness. The robe chant says the robe has no fixed form, just like the rest of the reality of emptiness. So in other words, the robe has a form, but that form itself is formless or empty. So there's nothing to which we can really attach ourselves. And that's one of the real teachings around Raksu and Okesa, right? Is that, it's Buddha's robe, it's not our possession, it's not something, even though we sort of think it's precious, we don't even attach to that. As soon as we do, we've kind of missed the point. We've kind of gone off the rails. And we really want to think these things are very precious and very holy and very special. But the fact that they're made from rags is part of the practice about not becoming attached to them, right? Because we know these things were originally made from cloth that mice had chewed, or cloth that came from corpses. And then, somehow we sew it into a robe and we think, well, it has been magically transformed. Somehow it is now pure and holy, right? Well, it's a great example of emptiness. So it's the same with all the other dharmas that we encounter. So to chant about the formless form of the robe, and then to put it on this body, which is, sort of the ultimate expression of form, the ultimate form that we work with every day. We wrap this body in this thing that represents emptiness. It's a really interesting teaching, right? When we really consider what that robe verse says and what that robe is and represents, and then we put it on this body, which is our most intimate experience of form. That's just a very interesting intersection. So Dogen says that everything is prajna precisely because it is empty. So it's the emptiness itself, that's really connected with prajna. So here's what Hojo-san says about that. Dogen cautions us not to live our lives according to our thinking. He admonishes us rather to just see and to just live. To live in this way means that we just see and experience what we encounter in our lives without saying it is empty, even though it truly is empty. That's it. We don't need to say this is empty, if it really is empty. Dogen placed importance on the true reality of each being rather than on any conceptual reality we might have of it. He saw that true reality does not dwell within our thinking, it is every one of myriad things. This is why Dogen said, form is nothing but form, emptiness is nothing but emptiness. 100 blades of grass, 10,000 things. 100 blades of grass and 10,000 things mean everything. In other words, everything is prajnaparamita because everything is empty. Prajna is not a personal individual wisdom we can possess. Rather, each thing is itself reality, and each thing is itself prajna, or wisdom. So this English word wisdom usually means we're using our knowledge or our experience or our good judgment or something, and then people think we're wise. Somehow we have the wisdom of experience or the wisdom of age, right? And so we think, well, that's what wisdom must mean here. It's very much about what we personally know or know how to do. It's precisely because we're more competent than somebody else that people look to us and say, oh, that's a wise person. We have some knowledge or some ability or something that somebody doesn't have. So it's a bit of a comparison there, right? So prajna is completely different. We translate prajna as wisdom, but this is not the kind of wisdom we're talking about. This is a completely different thing, this wisdom that sees emptiness. So it is not our individual ability to see emptiness. This is not something that we gain. It's not like, well, if I practice real hard, or if I practice for 100 years, I will somehow gain this wisdom that allows me to see emptiness in ways that other people don't see it. It's not a personal possession. So it's the reality of all things as empty. That is itself prajna. So each thing we encounter is wisdom because it is empty. So each thing that we encounter is not worried about whether or not it has self-nature. It's not caught up in those things. It's not worried about whether it's interconnected or whether it's impermanent. It is completely 100% manifesting those things in its infinite wisdom without the need to think about it or poke our head, poke a head in there and kind of wrestle with it. Each thing we encounter knows how to do everything it needs to do already, right? It knows everything it needs to know. It knows what to do and how to do it. So it's just existing in emptiness. So each simple thing we encounter, this does not have intellect. This is an example of prajna or a manifestation of prajna. It is 100% what it is. It 100% knows what to do and how to be what it is, right? So that in itself is prajna. So prajna is not a function of our minds. It's not a way of thinking. It's not a way of believing it. It's not, that we have to convince ourselves that emptiness is there and then somehow we have wisdom about emptiness. We don't need to do anything with that. It is just the true reality of things as they are in this moment. So it's not a case of me trying to see emptiness in things. I don't study this and look for the emptiness in it. That would be about me, which is not what this is about. It's not about trying to convince myself that everything is empty. And sometimes I think when we encounter teachings about emptiness, when we first encounter them, we think, well, this is some belief I need to adopt. I can't see emptiness, so I'm going to take it on faith that emptiness is there, and somehow, if I simply believe in it, that is prajna. That's not what we're talking about here. So to see a flower and to tell myself that flower is empty is already extra. This is what Dogen is saying in this piece that I just read. To look at something and say, well, this is empty, is to add something in there. It's my impression about this thing, or it's my idea about this thing. It's empty whether I say it is or not. I don't have to do anything to create that kind of emptiness. The emptiness isn't determined by whether or not I see it or whether or not I understand it. So I don't create emptiness the way I might think I've determined whether something is beautiful or ugly, or something is, tall or short, or red or green, or something, right? There's something there about, well, my perception creates something. Prajna, seeing the wisdom of emptiness, is not like that. So in the Shobogenzo Yuibutsu Yobutsu, which is only Buddha together with Buddha, Dogen says, an ancient Buddha who had never spoken once said as follows: in death there is the living, in life there is the dead. There are the dead who are always dead, there are the living who are always living. This is not what is forcibly made by a person. The Dharma is like this. So there seem to be opposites here, right? Form and emptiness, living and dead. But these things are not separate, right? They are, already completely interpenetrated. They're already completely not separate, living and dying, form and emptiness. So it's not necessary to say that life is death and death is life, or that there is only life or that there is only death. We're already adding something into that reality. So, these things are already empty. Prajna, or the true reality of all beings, is already there. So we don't create that truth by understanding it. And sometimes we'd like to think that that's what's going on, right? So, when Dogen is saying, living in life there's already death, and death there's already life, but also there is 100% death and 100% life. So somehow we understand that these things are connected, and just to say that they're connected is adding something extra. Within death there is already life. We don't need to say anything about that. So in the same way, Buddha didn't create the Dharma when he woke up under the tree. He didn't create the Dharma in the sense of the way the universe works, the true reality of all beings. Yes, Dharma and his teachings, yes, he went on to do that. But when he woke up under the tree, he didn't create the reality to which he awoke. That was already there. It predates him. That's simply the functioning of the universe. But somehow he had an awakening experience and saw something about the nature of reality. So, it might be good to say something here about the two truths. Sometimes in our practice or in our readings, we encounter something called the two truths. There's the absolute truth and the conventional truth. In other words, emptiness and form, right? So absolute truth is the reality of emptiness, or interdependent origination, that we cannot describe in words and concepts. We can't put ideas around emptiness. As soon as we do, we can't possibly tell the whole story. Words are limited. Human conceptions are limited. Emptiness is not limited. We can't step outside of emptiness. But as soon as we try to describe it, this is emptiness, we immediately create separation and duality, because then there's something which is not emptiness, which can't be. So we're already stuck if we're trying to use language to describe absolute truth. So we can only describe absolute truth in terms of conventional truth, or words and ideas that have meaning only in relation with other words and ideas. So we're sort of using conventional truth to do something that it can't actually do, but it's the best we can do in this limited human form. So we can't use thinking mind, our intellect, right, to understand absolute truth or to understand emptiness. Not possible. So, we have to see reality, hold reality from both sides, from the absolute and from the conventional. So this is the basis of Nagarjuna's philosophy, which is an important thread in the Mahayana. Nagarjuna is something like the 14th ancestor in our lineage. He's a famous guy. He said, by the way, that the teaching of emptiness is medicine for an illness called attachment. But when we cling to the idea of emptiness, we create another illness, another sickness, for which there is no medicine. So we can't cling to emptiness either. It's not like we're transcending form to get to someplace better called emptiness, because we can't live there. We can't cling to that. We simply create another whole set of problems, delusions and sicknesses and sufferings, right? So we have to hold both of these two truths in a balanced way without falling down only on one side or the other. We can't ignore form and we can't ignore emptiness. Somehow we get to hold these two truths in a sort of a balanced way. Because we know living only in the world of emptiness is something that in this modern day we frequently call spiritual bypassing. We want to say, well, everything is perfect, everything is emptiness, therefore, whatever I do in this world of form doesn't really matter. So if I'm using people in unhealthy ways, if I'm, breaking precepts, if I'm out for myself, in the big universe, everything is already perfect and empty. Well, no. Of course, as bodhisattvas, we can't do that. We can't carry out our bodhisattva vows with that kind of attitude. So we can't cling only to one side or the other. Anyway, Hojo-san says, holding these two truths is the central theme of the Mahayana. And we've heard this before, right? Seeing one reality from two sides and expressing two sides in one action. It's a handy thumbnail for one of the most important teachings in our tradition. So this is important to our ability to take beneficial action. There are two sides to our bodhisattva practice. We have to act with wisdom, but we also have to act with compassion. So Hojo-san says we need to sort of take a backward step to study ourselves and to clearly see the emptiness of all things. That's the backward step. And he says we also then need to take the forward step that actually goes out to help living beings who need things, who are suffering, and who we can help. So we need to do the backward and we need to do the forward. And again, I think it's a great image of expressing two sides, right, with one action. So emptiness can seem kind of abstract, It can seem kind of theoretical. We think, well, yeah, but that's not my sort of moment by moment existence. It's really not so concerned with my practical day-to-day life where I'm balancing the checkbook and washing the car and walking the dog. But that's because we have some idea about what emptiness is. And we've just said an idea about emptiness is already kind of a problem, but this is what we have to work with, this human form, right? So emptiness is nothing more than the complete interconnectedness of everything. So nothing has a separate self nature because we can't really say where is the boundary between one thing and another. We can distinguish objects, we can distinguish forms, but also we know nothing arises independent of other things. There's nothing that, is completely cut off. So, in a lot of ways we can say there kind of is no boundary between things. So we can't point to anything and say, well, this thing is completely independent of everything else. It's not affected by anything else. It kind of arose by itself, right? There's nothing we can point to and say that that's true. So Sawaki Roshi and Uchiyama Roshi say that because nothing is substantial, when we start fighting over things, it's like having a tug of war over clouds. I think it's a great image. What can we, can you grab a cloud and have a tug of war? No. So it's a great way to sort of open the hand around some of that stuff. Everything is the result of this temporary collection of causes and conditions. So everything is empty. Everything is non-substantial. That cloud is a temporary collection of water droplets. What about that can we grab and hold on to and say, mine? It doesn't work. So it's true that everything is this temporary collection and there's nothing we can grasp. And at the same time, it's also true that things exist, right? I mean, there are forms. We encounter forms, we manipulate forms, we live with forms. So we're not negating that in favor of emptiness. Forms exist, but forms are empty. And emptiness is also form. So we get to hold these two things. So I've just said a minute ago that emptiness can seem kind of abstract and theoretical. We might get it sort of intellectually, even if we know that our ideas about emptiness are not the whole story and are kind of provisional. But when it comes to actually practicing with this stuff and releasing ourselves from craving and aversion, right? Just sort of understanding that theoretical stuff in an intellectual way is not so helpful. We can get to the end of the usefulness of that. So it seems like our experience of objects is the real concrete truth. I mean, this is my moment by moment experience. So, this is my sort of concrete reality. It seems like this is all there is, and that the teachings about emptiness are kind of not so helpful, kind of abstract and out there. Interestingly, Uchiyama Roshi says it's actually our ideas about the objects that are the abstract element. It's my idea about this that's abstract, right? This thing is a concrete form, but my idea about it is abstract because I can't, I have an experience about this and immediately I have an idea, right? So it's really interesting. We're creating a layer of abstraction there, which we would think is, this is my concrete reality. There's something else going on there. So, I encounter an object, I give it a name, I decide whether I like it or not, I decide what its purpose is it helpful for me, does it remind me of something? Maybe I do that even by just seeing this object or remembering it or thinking about it, right? I mean, immediately we have these layers of abstraction. So none of that is the actual reality of that object. It's my idea that only exists in my head. And when you see this object, you have a different idea. You have your own set of abstractions about this thing, right? So this is not, the actual reality of this object. So, the actual reality of the object is emptiness. The actual reality of that object is that it's, this is only itself. It doesn't matter what I think about it. Here's emptiness, right? So it's an interesting set of things to practice with. So again, this Dharma gate says, the Dharma as an abode of mindfulness is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it wisdom is free from blurs. In other words, we have clarity, right? So I've said various things here about seeing emptiness or understanding emptiness, and I've also said that we can't grasp emptiness with the thinking mind. So how do we work with mindfulness of the true nature of reality, as this gate says? So Hojo-san says, we are very uncertain about almost everything. This uncertainty is a key element of the reality of our life. Actually, this uncertainty is a very important experience of the Buddhist teaching of emptiness. So it's okay that we don't get it. It's really okay that like we think I don't understand what's happening here. So Hojo-san's pointing out that when Dogen talks about not understanding in various places in the Shobogenzo, he talks about not understanding. This is not like, well, I missed the point, or well, I'm not smart enough, right? This kind of not understanding is not a negative thing. As usual, Dogen's language about this is his own his own kind of interpretation, or his own kind of articulation of this. So he uses a term in Japanese that can be translated as not understanding, but it can also be translated as to do not understanding, right? To actively do not understanding. You get the difference? It's kind of interesting. So in other words, to actively embrace not intellectually understanding, not getting caught up in creating concepts and attaching to concepts. So we're actually actively doing not understanding, which makes this a more positive thing. So this is what we do, when our sort of karmic consciousness kicks in. We write stories based on past experience. I encounter something, and I remember the last time I encountered this, or something similar to this, or something. My karmic conditions mean I write a story about something. So including the things we talked about with relation to the first three abodes of mindfulness, right? I encounter, I have some sense, input about this object immediately. I have some feeling about it. Is it pleasant, unpleasant, neutral? Thoughts and emotions arise. I write a story. I take some action, right? So doing not understanding is about keeping something in mind without grabbing it, without grasping it, with a kind of a personal understanding. Here's what this thing means for me, or here's what I think I know about this thing, or here's how I'm going to use this thing, right? So this is opening the hand of thought, just like we do in Zazen. This is the equivalent of it as we sort of move through the world. Can I encounter things? Can I take in information? Can I hold something in mind without grabbing onto it and sort of having a preconception about it and writing a story about it and creating a lot of abstraction, which really kind of separates me from this object or this experience. So Nishi Ariboku-san, who was one of Sawaki Roshi's teachers, and I've mentioned him here before, has something interesting to say. He says, the Buddha way does not fall into form and does not fall into emptiness. There is a point at which you jump off both form and emptiness and do not abide there. You must see through this. That is practice. At the time when we see all dharmas as dharmas, we will not fall into being and non-being. The reason is that being is free from being and emptiness is free from emptiness. As being is free from being, it is a real being. As emptiness is free from emptiness, it is true emptiness. Thus, all dharmas have the face and eyes of going beyond as dharma suchness. So when we say form, emptiness is already there. And when we say emptiness, form is already there. So it's not enough just to say form is emptiness and emptiness is form, because even that is only part of the story. Or we can maybe really only say form is form and emptiness is emptiness, because these things are interpenetrated. So we don't need to make a distinction. Some of these, and this is a theme that comes up in several places. Dogen says this, Hojo-san has talked about this, now Nishi Ariboku-san is talking about this. To say that there's a distinction, to separate form and emptiness is already extra, right? So there's form and emptiness as distinct, there's form and emptiness as not distinct. Prajna, clearly seeing wisdom, wisdom without blurs. Prajna is dropping the distinction between any conception about whether there's a distinction or not. Does that make sense? So there's form as form, there's no distinction. There's form as emptiness, we make a distinction. Prajna says we even drop the idea that we need to start dividing that up, that we even need to make a distinction or decide whether there is form as form and emptiness is emptiness or not. So each week here we've been considering this little piece that Dogen wrote about the four foundations of mindfulness in the Eihei Koroku. So finally we're at the end of this text now, this little bit, so we can talk about the last part. So again, this piece reads, our Buddha, Shakyamuni, said to his disciples, there are four foundations of mindfulness on which people should depend. These four foundations of mindfulness refer to contemplating the body as impure, contemplating sensation as suffering, contemplating mind as impermanent, and contemplating phenomena as non-substantial. I, Eihei, also have four foundations of mindfulness, contemplating the body as a skin bag, contemplating sensation as eating bowls, contemplating mind as fences, walls, tiles, and pebbles, and contemplating phenomena as old man Zhang drinking wine, old man Li getting drunk. Great Assembly, are my four foundations of mindfulness the same or different from the ancient Buddha's four foundations of mindfulness? If you say they are the same, your eyebrows will fall out from lying. If you say they are different, you will lose your body and life. So that section has become familiar now. This is the fourth time we've looked at it. So Buddha says contemplating phenomena is non-substantial. Dogen says contemplating phenomena is old man Zhang drinking wine, old man Li getting drunk. So that's the fourth piece, and the piece that's relevant to this Dharma gate. So again, my impression of this text is that Dogen is taking the original sort of more abstract text that Buddha is talking about and bringing it into a concrete world of things we might actually encounter. So he's doing it to help us see form and emptiness and to go beyond form and emptiness. So Buddha is talking more broadly about non-substantiality, contemplating all phenomena as non-substantial. So he's talking more broadly about non-substantiality. Nothing has a fixed nature in this universe of emptiness, right? So he's talking in a kind of a general way. Dogen says there are individual beings in the world. You know, there are forms, there are things we can distinguish. They are distinct. We can point to them. Zhang and Li are not the same person, right? So he's not negating the existence of form, but he's also making the point that the Dharma spreads and functions beyond, in ways that are sort of beyond our usual intellectual modes of perceiving. And it's happening because of emptiness, because everything is already interconnected. There's already no separation. So Zhang and Li are interconnected. They're two human beings. They're two different people. They probably have two different sets of karmic circumstances. We don't know anything more about them. But because they're already connected, one of them takes an action and the other one feels the effect, right? One of them is drinking. Supposedly the other one is getting drunk. So being mindful of Dharma and the wisdom of prajna isn't just about sort of processing what comes in through the sense gates and turning that into some human activity, which is driven by our karmic circumstances. Although those aspects of the universe are not being negated. They're not being cut off. They're not being left out or ignored or suppressed. Emptiness is beyond our usual modes of perceiving, and yet it is not supernatural. It's not otherworldly. It's not magic. Interestingly, when I was in grad school, one of my profs in Asian and Buddhist literature said that we shouldn't use the word supernatural when we're talking about sort of Buddhist themes. And, you know, often we, especially if we're looking at Buddhist culture, we encounter lots of like ghost stories or stories about bodhisattvas that sort of magically appear or change their form, or, you know, these things that we can think, well, these are kind of supernatural stories or supernatural themes. But, you know, my friend, this prof, said that's not a word we got to use because it implies there's something outside of nature. So supernatural implies there's something above or outside of nature. And there can't be anything outside of nature or outside of the Dharma or outside of the Buddha way. We can't kind of step out of that. So he tended to use the word fantastic as something which was imaginative, right? Or something which was fanciful, maybe. So we're not saying these things can't actually happen. Maybe they're expressions of our sort of creative minds, right? But I thought that was really interesting because, you know, he's sort of pointing back to saying we can't step outside of. So emptiness is not something supernatural. Emptiness is not something which is outside of our moment by moment, day to day existence and experience. It's right here in the midst of form, right? And it's not separate from the forms we encounter. So why is emptiness so important for us? And how can we be aware of emptiness in our moment by moment practice? Well, the clearest manifestation of emptiness is simply in being released from clinging. Anytime we notice in our practice that maybe we have overcome some bit of clinging, or we've seen through some bit of clinging or craving or aversion, you know, because if everything is empty, then there's nothing we can be attached to. So if we open the hand, if we can somehow understand about non-clinging, non-attachment, that in itself is the manifestation of emptiness. So, you know, if we're not caught up in clinging, we manifest that just in our day-to-day, moment-by-moment activity. So that means we give and offer more freely, right? We don't feel like, well, if I give something away, I'm less than because I need to cling to this thing for my, you know, small self. We're much better able to move through the world with open hands, right? To give and offer more freely without worrying about, well, what am I going to get out of it? Am I going to lose something or am I going to gain something? It means that when things come and go in our lives, we can let those things come and go. If it's their time to arrive, that's good. If it's their time to go, it's their time to go. We can do that without creating suffering or so much suffering for ourselves. It means we can be happy for other people when something good happens for them without trying to get a piece of whatever they've got. Or, whipping out the yardstick and saying, well, I deserve that and he or she didn't deserve that. And we set up a whole lot of, suffering based on our craving and aversion. So, we can be happy for somebody who gets a promotion or gets a new item they need or has a new baby or whatever that is. We can be pleased for them. And that's not about something I need to get back. It means we're free from our fixed ideas about good and bad, life and death, self and other, form and emptiness. We can really jump out of the need to create a lot of separation. And we can see how there's interconnection. It means the impulse to steal things doesn't arise. Again, if there's nothing I can attach to, and if in this world of emptiness there's nothing I don't already have, then I feel much less need to break the second precept and get things, steal things from people that aren't actually offered. And also I understand there is no self that can possess something. So even, if I think I can take something and own it, of course, I can't, because there's no self that can own something. So the wisdom that sees emptiness means not getting stuck anywhere. That's what it feels like to me. It feels like we're able to move through the world, navigate the world without getting stuck and clinging to things. It also means we're not trying to leave this world for a better place. We know samsara and nirvana, not two things. Nirvana is already here. So it's not like I need to somehow leave this, impure, unhappy place where I am and get to somewhere else in order to ever have some contentment or have some happiness. And now, of course, we're back to this bit of the Aksayamati Sutra that I read in the beginning of this talk that says, when bodhisattvas rest and look at experience, they don't see any experience at all. I think that's a really interesting and rather beautiful quote. When bodhisattvas rest and look at experience, they don't see any experience at all. So I immediately think of Uchiyama Roshi's intersection of peace and progress, which we talk about or at least I do, talk about all the time here. We rest in emptiness because emptiness is already here. We don't need to go looking for that. The wisdom that sees emptiness is already here. And also in the midst of that stillness, there is this dynamic activity. The universe is functioning. The universe is doing what it does. Awakening is carrying out awakening. Bodhisattvas are engaged in beneficial action, but they don't see any experience at all. Because of prajna, they don't see a being carrying out an activity and having an experience, right? They're not making a separation. They see complete functioning without separation. They see complete functioning in emptiness without something that says, well, there's a me and I'm carrying out an activity and maybe there's a reward at the end, right? They see call and response arising together. There's a need in the universe and somehow the response is already there too, right? There's this completely interpenetrated functioning. Call and response arising together. Vow and repentance are also rising together. As soon as we do something as bodhisattvas, we know our practice is always going to be incomplete. There's already that awareness. There's already that understanding. So these things are rising together. So these bodhisattvas recognize that there are distinct forms and also there are no forms and that naming form and emptiness isn't necessary. In this completely interpenetrating dynamic functioning of the universe, it's not necessary to name things and call them out and create separation. So mindfulness of the Dharma, such that wisdom is free from blurs, is just like this. This is the bodhisattva resting and also seeing no experience. So the bodhisattva rests and looks at experience and doesn't see any experience at all. This is exactly this gate. This is exactly mindfulness of Dharma and wisdom without blurs. So what would you all like to say about emptiness and form, or anything that's arising for you at this moment based on things we're talking about today, or other things happening in your practice? Let me throw it open to you. And of course, unmute yourself so we can hear you if you have something you'd like to say. We're empty of comments today. Okay.
I think it's just that this is way deep, and not necessarily easy to grasp. I think of, the first lines of the Dhammapada that talk about we make the world with our thoughts. And when I think talking with a friend recently about what kind of turmoil they were going through around the pandemic and with their family and all that. And I said something to the effect, trying to quote the Buddha and the Dhammapada, that they are just thoughts. There is this place that Dharma lives, that where you can free yourself from that kind of self-torture. I hope it was helpful.
Well, and of course, that's not easy, right? Because in the minute that at the time that we're caught up in something, it can be very difficult to say, these are just my thoughts, because they feel very powerful. There are times that we're just caught up in stuff, but sometimes in our practice or in our moment by moment life, we do get the opportunity to say, I'm creating something here. I'm adding something in to this circumstance, which is only mine. It's not the true reality of what's in front of me. This concrete thing doesn't care what I think about it. I remember the first time I somehow had a flash of something, and I really got that the thing in front of me didn't care what I thought about it, or didn't care what what was going on in my particular, had I had a bad day that day, it didn't affect this.
Right.
It didn't matter about this was not affected by that, because that was all my own stuff. I thought, oh, that was pretty interesting, right? But that's not easy. When we're caught up in things, it's not easy to put those things down. And I think we have to give ourselves the space in this human form to say, I'm hijacked by stuff, I'm caught up in stuff. It needs to play itself out. One hopes we don't take unskillful action based on that. One hopes we have a little bit of awareness and mindfulness, and we're not going to go out and take some unskillful action. But we, in this human form, we feel things, we experience things, we make mistakes. That's what vow and repentance is for. And I think, in your case, Hoshin, if you're talking with other people and doing what amounts to a little bit of pastoral care, that's an additional challenge. Because it's not your experience, it's somebody else's, and how do we put ourselves in the places of people who are suffering? Sometimes all we can do is just sit there and be present. There are times we can teach about the Dharma, and then there are times where this is just not a teachable moment.
Right.
And all we can do is sort of be present. Yeah, not easy. Other things people would like to say? Questions, reflections, observations? Are we good for today? As Hoshin has said, this is not easy material, and it's material we sort of just need to sit with a little bit, which is okay. We certainly know we encounter form and emptiness and teachings about form and emptiness regularly, so this is not our only pass at this, right? So, with today, we've wrapped up 4 foundations of mindfulness, and next time we'll go on to other topics. Before we do that, is there anything anybody wants to say about 4 foundations as a whole? We've talked about body, and we've talked about sensation, and how thoughts arise, and action, and all of those things. Any final questions about any of that?
Hoku, I'd like to know your source for that.
For the gate statements?
Yeah, well, for that, but the 4 foundations.
Well, I didn't have one source, and I have to say, the piece from the Eihei Koroku that Dogen wrote is one of the few things that I've encountered that Dogen actually said about it. So I have tended to quote from Hojo-san and from Uchiyama Roshi throughout their various writings. There isn't one source, they've all written various things, and I've tended to quote from from various of their writings, published and unpublished. Some of the things today were not even published material. So I can't point to one source within our Dharma family for that. I think there are books out there They may tend to come from more of a Theravadan point of view, because this is a really old teaching. I mean, if you go back and look at where does Satipatthana come from, you know, there's an old sutra and there's various teaching around that. I wanted to make sure that for our purposes, I was really addressing this from within the scope of our own Dharma family, which is not better or worse, but, you know, I'm trying to put it in terms of things that we've already encountered, you know, just within our particular style. There's tons of material out there on the 4 foundations of mindfulness.
Okay.
There's books you can find, but, you know, for the purpose of our conversations about this these last 4 weeks, I'm not giving you a book report. I've tended to read widely about what our particular lineage has had to say. Nishiyari is not formally in our lineage, but he's one of Sawaki Roshi's teachers, and of course had some influence on him. Right. So offline, I can point you to, you know, what the various books are and whatnot, but there's not one source. Can't give you one source. Other than I can tell you where what translation of the 108 gates I'm using, but you probably don't care about that. Okay. Anything else this morning before we move on to our chant and announcements and service? Everyone good for now? Okay, very good. Thanks so much.